The Three Musketeers by Alexandre Dumas, published by George Routledge and Sons, London, 1878. Chapter 2, The Antechamber of Monsieur de Treville. Monsieur de Treville, as his family was still called in Gascony, or Monsieur de Treville, as he had ended by styling himself in Paris, had really commenced life as D'Artagnan now did, that is to say, without a sou in his pocket, but with a fund of courage, shrewdness, and intelligence that makes the poorest Gascon gentleman often derive more in his hope from the paternal inheritance than the richest Pangordian or Berrichan gentleman derives in reality from his. His insolent bravery, his still more insolent success, at a time when blows poured down like hail, had borne him to the top of that ladder called court favor, which he had climbed 4 steps at a time. He was the friend of the king, who honored highly, as everyone knows, the memory of his father, Henry IV. The father of Monsieur de Treville had served him so faithfully in his wars against the League that for want of money, a thing to which the Béarnais was accustomed all his life, and who constantly paid his debts with that of which he never stood in need of borrowing, that is to say, with ready wit, for want of money, we repeat, he authorized him, after the reduction of Paris, to assume for his arms a golden lion passant upon gules, with the device of Fidelis et Fortis. This was a great matter in the way of honor, but very little in the way of wealth, so that when the illustrious companion of the great Henry died, the only inheritance he was able to leave his son was his sword and his device. Thanks to this double gift and the spotless name that accompanied them, Monsieur de Treville was admitted into the household of the young prince, where he made such good use of his sword, and was so faithful to his device, that Louis XIII, one of the good blades of his kingdom, was accustomed to say that, if he had a friend who was about to fight, he would advise him to choose as a second, himself first, and Treville next, or even perhaps before him. Thus Louis XIII had a real liking for Treville, a royal liking, a selfish liking, it is true, but which was still a liking. At that unhappy period, it was an important consideration to be surrounded by such men as de Treville. Many might take for their device the epithet of strong, which formed the second part of his motto, but very few gentlemen could lay claim to the faithful, which constituted the first. Treville was one of these latter. His was one of those rare organizations endowed with an obedient intelligence like that of a dog, with a blind valor, a quick eye, and a prompt hand, to whom sight appeared only to be given to see if the king were dissatisfied with anyone, and with the hand to strike this displeasing anyone, whether a Besme, a Moravers, a Paltois de Marais, or a Vitry. In short, up to this period, nothing had been wanting to de Treville but opportunity, but he was ever on the watch for it, and he promised himself that he would never fail to seize it by its 3 hairs whenever it came within reach of his hand. Louis XIII then made de Treville the captain of his musketeers, who were to Louis XIII in devotedness, or rather in fanaticism, what his ordinaires had been to Henry III, and his Scotch Guard to Louis XI. On his part, and in this respect, the cardinal was not behindhand with the king. When he saw the formidable and chosen body by which Louis XIII surrounded himself, this second, or rather the first king of France, became desirous that he too should have his guard. He had his musketeers then, as Louis XIII had his, and these 2 powerful rivals vied with each other in procuring the most celebrated swordsmen, not only from all the provinces of France, but even from all foreign states. It was not uncommon for Richelieu and Louis XIII to dispute over their evening game of chess upon the merits of their servants. Each boasted the bearing and the courage of his own people, and whilst exclaiming loudly against duels and broils, they excited them secretly to quarrel, deriving an immoderate satisfaction or a true regret at the success or defeat of their own combatants. We learn this from the memoirs of a man who was concerned in some few of these defeats and in many of these victories. And it was to this address that he owed the long and constant favor of a king who has not left the reputation behind him of having been very faithful in his friendships. He paraded his musketeers before the Cardinal Armand du Plessis with an insolent air, which made the grey moustache of his eminence curl with ire. Treville was a master of the war of that period, in which he who did not live at the expense of the enemy lived at the expense of his compatriots. His soldiers formed a legion of devil-may-care fellows, perfectly undisciplined as regards everyone but himself. Loose, half-drunk, imposing, the king's musketeers, or rather Monsieur de Treville's, spread themselves about in the cabarets, in the public walks, and the public sports, shouting, twisting their mustaches, clanking their swords, and taking great pleasure in annoying the guards of Monsieur le Cardinal whenever they could fall in with them, then drawing in the open streets, as if it were the best of all possible sports, sometimes killed, but sure in that case to be both wept and avenged, often killing others, but then certain of not rotting in prison, Monsieur de Treville being there to claim them. Thus Monsieur de Treville was praised to the highest note by these men, who absolutely adored him, and who, ruffians as they were, trembled before him like scholars before their master, obedient to the least word, and ready to sacrifice themselves to wash out the smallest insult. Monsieur de Treville employed this powerful machine for the king in the first place, and the friends of the king, and then for himself and his own friends. For the rest, in none of the memoirs of this period, which has left so many memoirs, is this worthy gentleman accused even by his enemies, and he had many such among men of the pen, as well as among men of the sword. In no instance, we are told, was this worthy gentleman accused of deriving personal advantage from the cooperation of his minions. Endowed with a rare genius for intrigue, which rendered him the equal of the ablest intriguers, he remained an honest man. Still further, in spite of sword thrusts which weaken and painful exercises which fatigue, he had become one of the most gallant frequenters of revels, one of the most insinuating squires of dames, one of the softest whisperers of interesting nothings of his day. The bonne fortune of de Treville was talked of as those of Monsieur de Bassompierre had been talked of 20 years before, and that was not saying a little. The captain of the musketeers then was admired, feared, and loved, which constitutes the apogee of human fortunes. Louis XIV absorbed all the smaller stars of his court in his own vast radiance, but his father, a son pluribus impar, left his personal splendor to each of his favorites, his individual value to each of his courtiers. In addition to the levee of the king and that of the cardinal, there might be reckoned in Paris at the time more than 200 smaller levees, each in its degree attended. Among these 200 levees, that of de Treville was one of the most thronged. The court of his hotel, situated in the Rue de Vieux Colombier, resembled a camp, and that by 6 o'clock in the morning in summer and 8 o'clock in winter, from 50 to 60 musketeers, who appeared to relieve each other in order, always to present an imposing number, paraded constantly about, armed to the teeth and ready for anything. On one of those immense staircases upon whose space modern civilization would build a whole house, ascended and descended the solicitors of Paris, who were in search of favors of any kind, gentlemen from the provinces anxious to be enrolled, and servants in all sorts of liveries bringing and carrying messages between their masters and Monsieur de Treville. In this apartment a continued buzzing prevailed from morning till night, whilst Monsieur de Treville, in his closet contiguous to the antechamber, received visits, listened to complaints, gave his orders, and like the king in his balcony at the Louvre, had only to place himself at the window to review both men and arms. The day on which D'Artagnan presented himself, the assemblage was imposing, particularly for a provincial just arriving from his province. It is true that this provincial was a Gascon, and that particularly at this period the compatriots of D'Artagnan had the reputation of not being easily intimidated. When he had once passed the massive door, covered with long square-headed nails, he fell into the midst of a troop of men of the sword, who crossed each other in their passage, calling out, quarreling, and playing tricks one among another. To make way through these turbulent and conflicting waves, it required to be an officer, a great noble, or a pretty woman. It was then into the midst of this tumult and disorder that our young man advanced with a beating heart, ranging his long rapier up his lanky leg, and keeping one hand on the edge of his cap with that provincial half-smile which affects confidence. When he had passed one group, he began to breathe more freely, but he could not help observing that they turned round to look at him, and for the first time in his life, D'Artagnan, who had till that day entertained a very good opinion of himself, felt that he was the object of ridicule. When arrived at the staircase, it was still worse. There were 4 musketeers on the bottom steps amusing themselves with the following exercise, whilst 10 or 12 of their comrades waited upon the landing place, their turns to take their place in the sport. One of them, placed upon the top stair, naked sword in hand, prevented, or at least endeavored to prevent, the 3 others from going up. These 3 others fenced against him with their agile swords, which D'Artagnan at first took for foils and believed to be buttoned, but he soon perceived, by certain scratches, that every weapon was pointed and sharpened, and that at each of these scratches, not only the spectators, but even the actors themselves, laughed like so many madmen. He who at the moment occupied the upper step kept his adversaries in check admirably. A circle was formed around them. The conditions required that at every hit, the person hit should quit the game, losing his turn of audience to the advantage of the person who had hit him. In 5 minutes, 3 were slightly wounded, 1 on the hand, another on the chin, and the third on the ear, by the defender of the stair, who himself remained intact. A piece of skill which was worth to him, according to agreement, 3 turns of favor. However difficult it might be, or rather as he pretended it was, to astonish our young traveler, this pastime really astonished him. He had seen in his province, the land in which heads become so easily heated, a few of the preliminaries of duels, but the gasconades of these 4 fencers appeared to him the strongest he had ever heard, even in Gascony. He believed himself transported into that famous country of giants, into which Gulliver since went and was so frightened. And yet he had not gained the goal, for there was still the landing place and the antechamber. On the landing they were no longer fighting, but amused themselves with stories about women, and in the antechamber with stories about the court. On the landing D'Artagnan blushed, in the antechamber he trembled. His warm and fickle imagination, which in Gascony had rendered him formidable to young chambermaids, and even sometimes to their mistresses, had never dreamt, even in moments of delirium, of half the amorous wonders or a quarter of the feats of gallantry, which were here set forth, accompanied by names the best known, and with details the least delicate. But if his morals were shocked on the landing, his respect for the cardinal was scandalized in the antechamber. There, to his great astonishment, D'Artagnan heard the policy which made all Europe tremble, criticized aloud and openly, as well as the private life of the cardinal, which had brought about the punishment of so many great nobles for having dared to pry into. That great man, who was so revered by D'Artagnan the elder, served as an object of ridicule to the musketeers, who cracked their jokes upon his bandy legs and his humped back. Some sang ballads upon Madame d'Aiguillon, his mistress, and Madame Cambalet, his niece, whilst others formed parties and plans to annoy the pages and guards of the Cardinal Duke, all things which appeared to D'Artagnan monstrous impossibilities. Nevertheless, when the name of the king was now and then uttered unthinkingly amongst all these cardinal jokes, a sort of gag seemed to close for a moment all these jeering mouths. They looked hesitatingly around them, and appeared to doubt the thickness of the partition between them and the closet of Monsieur de Treville. But a fresh allusion soon brought back the conversation to his eminence, and then the laughter recovered its loudness, and no coloring was spared to any of his actions. Certes, these fellows will all be either embastilled or hung, thought the terrified D'Artagnan, and I no doubt with them, for from the moment I have either listened to or heard them, I shall be held to be an accomplice. What would my good father say, who so strongly pointed out to me the respect due to the cardinal, if he knew I was in the society of such pagans? We have no need, therefore, to say that D'Artagnan did not venture to join in the conversation. Only he looked with all his eyes and listened with all his ears, stretching his five senses so as to lose nothing. And in spite of his confidence in the paternal monitions, he felt himself carried by his tastes and led by his instincts to praise rather than to blame the unheard-of things which were passing before him. D'Artagnan being, however, a perfect stranger in the crowd of Monsieur de Treville's courtiers, and this his first appearance in that place, he was at length noticed, and a person came to him and asked him his business there. At this demand, D'Artagnan gave his name very modestly, laid a stress upon the title of compatriot, and begged the servant who had put the question to him to request a moment's audience of Monsieur de Treville, a request which the other, with an air of protection, promised to convey in time and season. D'Artagnan, a little recovered from his first surprise, had now the leisure to study costumes and countenances. The center of the most animated group was a musketeer of great height, of a haughty countenance, and dressed in a costume so peculiar as to attract general attention. He did not wear the uniform cloak, which indeed at that time, less of liberty than of still greater independence, was not obligatory, but a cerulean blue doublet, a little faded and worn, and over this a magnificent baldric worked in gold, which shone like water ripples in the sun. A long cloak of crimson velvet fell in graceful folds from his shoulders, disclosing in front the splendid baldric, from which was suspended a gigantic rapier. This musketeer had just come off guard, complained of having a cold, and coughed from time to time affectedly. It was for this reason, he said to those around him, he had put on his cloak, and whilst he spoke with lofty air, and twisted his mustache, all admired his embroidered baldric, and D'Artagnan more than anyone. "What do you make a wonder about?" asked the musketeer. "The fashion is coming in. It is folly, I admit, but still it is the fashion. Besides, one must lay out one's inheritance somehow." "Ah, Porthos," cried one of his companions, "don't think to palm upon us that you obtained that baldric by paternal generosity. It was given to you by that veiled lady I met you with the other Sunday, near the gate Saint-Honoré." "No, upon honor, by the faith of a gentleman, I bought it with the contents of my own purse," answered he whom they designated under the name of Porthos. "Yes, in about the same manner," said another musketeer, "as I bought this new purse with the money my mistress put in the old one." "It's true, though," said Porthos, "and the proof is that I paid 12 pistoles for it." The wonder was increased, though the doubt continued to exist. "Is it not true, Aramis?" said Porthos, turning towards another musketeer. This other musketeer formed a perfect contrast with his interrogator, who had just designated him by the name of Aramis. He was a stout man, of about 2 or 23, with an open, ingenuous countenance, a black, mild eye, and cheeks rosy and downy as an autumn peach. His delicate mustache marked a perfectly straight line upon his upper lip. He appeared to dread to lower his hands lest their veins should swell, and he pinched the tips of his ears from time to time to preserve their delicate pink transparency. Habitually he spoke little and slowly, bowed frequently, laughed without noise, showing his teeth, which were fine, and of which, as of the rest of his person, he appeared to take great care. He answered the appeal of his friend by an affirmative nod of the head. This affirmation appeared to dispel all doubts with regards to the baldric. They continued to admire it, but said no more about it, and with one of the rapid changes of thought, the conversation passed suddenly to another subject. "What do you think of the story Chalet's esquire relates?" asked another musketeer without addressing anyone in particular. "And what does he say?" asked Porthos in a self-sufficient tone. "He relates that he met at Brussels Rochefort, the âme damnée of the cardinal, disguised as a Capuchin, and that this cursed Rochefort, thanks to this disguise, had tricked Monsieur de Légué like a simpleton as he is." "A simpleton indeed," said Porthos. "But is the matter certain?" "I had it from Aramis," replied the musketeer. "Indeed?" "Why, you know it is, Porthos," said Aramis. "I told you of it yesterday. Say nothing more about it." Say nothing more about it. That's your opinion, replied Porthos. Say nothing more about it. Peste, you come to your conclusions quickly. What? The cardinal sets a spy upon a gentleman? Has his letters stolen from him by means of a traitor, a brigand, a rascal? Has, with the help of the spy, and thanks to this correspondence, Chalaise's throat cut, under the stupid pretext that he wanted to kill the king and marry Monsieur to the queen? Nobody knew a word of this enigma. You unraveled it yesterday, to the great satisfaction of all. And whilst we all are still gaping with wonder at the news, you come and tell us today, let us say no more of it. Well then, let us speak about it, since you desire it, replied Aramis patiently. This Rochefort, cried Porthos, if I were poor Chalaise's esquire, should pass a minute or two very uncomfortably with me. And you would pass rather a sad half-hour with the Red Duke, replied Aramis. Oh, the Red Duke, bravo, bravo, the Red Duke, cried Porthos, clapping his hands and holding his head. The Red Duke is capital. I'll circulate that saying, be assured, my dear fellow. Who says this Aramis is not a wit? What a misfortune it is you did not follow your first vocation. What a delightful abbé you would have made. Oh, it's only a temporary postponement, replied Aramis. I shall be one some day. You very well know, Porthos, that I continue to study theology for that purpose. He will be one, as he says, cried Porthos. He will be one, sooner or later. Soon, said Aramis. He only waits for one thing to determine him to resume his cassock, which hangs behind his uniform, said another musketeer. What is he waiting for? Asked another. Only till the Queen has given an heir to the crown of France. No jokes upon that subject, gentlemen, said Porthos. Thank God the Queen is still of an age to give one. They say that Monsieur de Buckingham is in France, replied Aramis, with a significant smile, which gave to this sentence, apparently so simple, a tolerably scandalous meaning. Aramis, my good friend, this time you are wrong, interrupted Porthos. Your wit is always leading you astray. If Monsieur de Treville heard you, you would repent of speaking thus. Are you going to teach me better, Porthos? Cried Aramis, from whose usually mild eye a flash passed like lightning. My dear fellow, be a musketeer or an abbé. Be one or the other, but not both, replied Porthos. You know what Athos told you the other day. You eat at everybody's mess. Ah, don't be angry, I beg of you. That would be useless. You know what is agreed upon between you, Athos, and me. You go to Madame Aiguillon's, and you pay your court to her. You go to Madame de Bois Tracy's, the cousin of Madame de Chevreuse, and you pass for being far advanced in the good graces of that lady. Oh, good Lord, don't trouble yourself to reveal your good fortunes. No one asks for your secret. All the world knows your discretion. But since you possess that virtue, why the devil don't you make use of it with respect to Her Majesty? Let whoever likes talk of the king and the cardinal, and how he likes, but the Queen is sacred, and if anyone speaks of her, let it be well. Porthos, you are as vain as Narcissus. I plainly tell you so, replied Aramis. You know I hate moralizing, except when it's done by Athos. As to you, good sir, you wear too magnificent a baldric to be strong on that head. I will be an abbé if it suits me. In the meanwhile, I am a musketeer. In that quality, I say what I please, and at this moment, it pleases me to say that you annoy me. Aramis! Porthos! Gentlemen, gentlemen, cried the surrounding group. Monsieur de Treville awaits Monsieur d'Artagnan, cried a servant, throwing open the door of the cabinet. At this announcement, during which the door remained open, everyone became mute, and amidst the general silence the young man crossed the antechamber in a part of its length and entered the apartment of the captain of the Musketeers, congratulating himself with all his heart at having so narrowly escaped the end of this strange quarrel.